Just yesterday, Next.js announced that the app directory is now stable and ready for use in production.
This is the Next.js app router, stable and ready for production today in Next.js 13.4.
That's great news, but what's more exciting is they just announced a new feature called Server Actions, which allows you to write one-off server-side functions right alongside your server components. And that's huge because it means you no longer need to write individual API routes when submitting forms or doing any other kind of data mutation. In today's video, you'll learn 5 different ways to use Next.js Server Actions, and in the process, we'll build a form that you can edit with real data that has a skeleton loading UI between updates. And we'll also throw in a like button with optimistic updates. And you'll be amazed at how much easier this code is to write with Server Actions. But first, not everybody is convinced. On Twitter, people have been roasting this feature because at first glance, it looks so similar to PHP, where you might have an index.php file that co-locates your HTML with different server-side endpoints. And that's totally correct, but at the same time, it completely misses the point. When you run a server action with Next, it doesn't completely reload the page like a traditional PHP app would, and instead only re-renders the server components. That means you can create an awesome front-end experience with React while easily integrating server-side code. As you may know, I like to throw a lot of shade at React, but honestly, I think server components combined with actions is one of the coolest things they've ever done. It's a classic React feature, huge productivity boost with plenty of ways to shoot yourself in the foot. It'll be easier if I just show you, so let's go ahead and generate a new Next application. And by the way, this video is part of my brand new Next.js 13 course, which you can now access on Fireship.io. It contains over 30 fast-paced videos covering a bunch of different rendering, data fetching, and caching strategies. The first thing you'll likely want to use Server Actions for is to handle form submissions that update some data in your database. In this demo, we have a dynamic route under dog/ID, which displays a card with some profile information. Under that dynamic route, we have another page that contains a form to edit this data. Prior to actions, the way you would do this is to create an API route somewhere that uses a post or put request to run the actual mutation. Then you would create a client component that makes a fetch call to that endpoint. Then on top of that, to show the updates in the page, you'll need to bring in the use transition hook from React and tell the client-side router to refresh the page. It's way more complicated than it should be. Luckily, actions change all that. Currently here in our edit form, we're first fetching data in the server component, and for the database, I'm using Vercel's new key value database, but feel free to use whatever data source you'd like. Once we have our data, which is just a dog object with a name, image, and breed, we can then use it as the default values here in the form. On the form itself, we don't use the client-side onSubmit event handler, we instead pass it an action. This is a special property that takes a function and will provide the data from the form to run server-side code. Let's go ahead and define that function right here in the component body. Create an async function named updog that receives the form data as an argument. But you might be wondering, what's up, dog? Not much. What's going on with you, dog? I'm just working on this server function here that's special because it has this use server directive. Next.js will automatically turn this into a server-side endpoint, and you can access things like headers and cookies here if needed. In this case, we'll take our form data and update the database, and that's literally all you need to create a mutation. If we go into the browser and open up the network tab and then submit the form, you'll notice that it sends a request to the URL that we're currently on. It's a post request that runs that function we just defined on the server. That's pretty cool, but you'll notice that it doesn't automatically update the UI. That's not ideal. You'll likely want to show the latest data after the mutation is complete. Well, we can easily fix that by importing revalidate path from Next cache, which will tell it to revalidate the page and update the server components. But what makes this so awesome is that it automatically updates the data that we fetched in the UI. It doesn't need a full page reload. In addition, we can easily implement loading UI by simply adding a loading component to this directory. And now when we run the mutation, we get this skeleton UI that's displayed while the mutation is taking place. I'm not going to cover the CSS for the skeleton UI, but you can find it in the full course notes. That may or may not be desirable in the UI, but let's just take a moment to appreciate how easy it was to implement compared to previous versions of Next. The second thing you need to know is that you can use multiple actions on the same form. Currently, updog is our default form action, but let's go ahead and add a second button to this form, but give this one the form action property that points to a completely different server function. This function will also update the database, but instead it will use Next navigation to redirect back to the main profile page. So it's like a save and quit feature, but you could really do anything you want here, like upload an image or update an individual form field or whatever. Now, if we go back to the demo, we have 2 different ways to submit the same form. That's pretty cool, but the third thing you should know is that server actions are composable, and that means we don't need to define them directly inside the server component. It's often useful to define them there because they can access other data that you've already fetched, but you could just as easily extract them outside the component or put them in a completely different file. For example, we might create an actions.ts file that exports multiple server functions. One benefit of doing this is that we can just put the use server directive at the top, and it will apply apply to all the functions in this file. But more importantly, we can now reuse these actions in any component. That's pretty cool, but the fourth thing you should know is that the action property only works on elements inside of a form, because server components can't handle client-side interactions like button clicks. However, it is still possible to trigger server actions from client components. In this example, we have two server actions of like and dislike that will increment and decrement a value in the database, and then revalidate that path. Then from there, we have a client component called likes. It imports the like and dislike actions from that file, and also the use transition hook from React. Use transition is essential here because it allows us to update state without blocking the UI. What that means in this case is that it will execute the server action, then the Next.js router will reload the server component and update the state all in a single round trip. To make that happen, we have this somewhat ugly code here where we need to wrap the server action inside of start transition. But once that's done, we can now go back to our component and click the button, which will run the mutation, but also refetch the latest like count from the parent server component, and does so all in one round trip, which would be way more complex to handle without server components. You'd likely need to bring in useEffect in a client component, and you'll probably end up losing your mind in the process. In fact, one of my favorite things about server components in general is they eliminate the need to use useEffect in most of your components. But the fifth thing you should know is that actions can also support optimistic updates. One problem with our current implementation is that when you click the button, there's like a few 100-millisecond delay before the like count actually updates. And that's not ideal. Tools like Firebase have been doing optimistic updates for the last 10 years to make it appear like the server has zero latency. I'm going to go ahead and re-implement our like button, but this time, instead of use transition, I'm going to bring in an experimental hook called use optimistic. This hook is basically like a combination of use transition and use reducer in React. It'll update the UI instantly with what you think the server is going to respond with. Then when the server actually does respond, it will sync up the true value. Usually that would mean there was some kind of server error, and so it rolls back to the previous value. In this component, we'll also pass in the like count from the server component, and then we'll add an additional property of sending so we know when the actual update is taking place. From there, we define a reducer function that takes the previous state and then updates it with the latest value. Now from here, we go into the click handlers for our buttons, and we call the server action just like we did previously, but we also use the hook to update a value that we think the like count will be, which in this case would be the current like count plus or minus 1. And now if we go to the demo, we can compare the two like buttons side by side. You'll notice that in the optimistic button, the like count changes as soon as we click it, and that'll make your server look extremely fast even though it's not. As of today, server actions are in alpha, but they open the door to all kinds of awesome patterns. If you want to get really good at Next 13, check out my full pro course where we'll continue to explore the possibilities with server actions. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.